So last time we got together, we talked about the Great Chautauqua Lake Race. And you also have done other books in and around about Chautauqua Lake, muskies and other things. Do you find that after you've done books, you learn more information? People come out of the woodwork and you say, gosh, I wish I knew that when I was writing the book?
Absolutely. I have presented about probably a dozen times on the ice industry in Chautauqua Lake, which was a huge part of our industrial past, here in Chautauqua County. And each time I do, I ask if there's members of the audience who have memories of the ice industry or relatives who worked in the ice industry, and invariably there's at least a dozen most every place I speak. And they've got great memories, or they tell me of another ice house of which I didn't know. When I started that book, I knew of 6, and I found well over 100, some of which are still in existence today and are part of our accepted landscape. So, yeah, I get a lot of feedback, and it's all good.
What do you do with it? I mean, in reality, do you salt it away for an updated book at some point, or you just salt it away?
No, I keep telling my wife this is the last book I'm going to do. When I wrote this one, I had written several others, and hawking books really isn't my stock in trade. It takes a lot of work. And so this book is a donation to the Lawson Center down in Bemis Point. And I was fortunate enough to know Randy Sweeney, the past director of the Chautauqua County Community Foundation. And Randy gathered up the funding to get it printed for free. So every time one of those books gets sold, it's 100% donation to the Lawson Center. So
it's a good time to hawk it. You have some books here. How much is it?
I do have books. They're $16 in tax, but I would have to have you write a check to the Lawson Center. I've officially divorced myself from that, but you can go online on their website at thelawsoncenter.com, and there's a place there where you can also email in your information and get a book.
So it's a tax deduction. You get a book. You write it to the Lawson Center for $20. Just write a check, guys. Be serious.
That's right.
Right there you go. You're ahead of the game. So, in your family history, was Criff-Craft part of your world?
Well, I lived for the first probably 15, 18 years of my life directly across from the Lawson Center. And so Criff-Crafts were definitely a part of my life. And I was recounting the story before we started here tonight. As a child, my dad left home when I was 6, and I was fortunate enough to have a state trooper by the name of Pete Darling work summers across the street at the boat livery. And Pete gave my brother and I a double-end rowboat. And they're pretty much like a canoe. And my brother was inherently lazy. He wouldn't wash it.
He's going to hear this.
He'll hear it. He wouldn't sand it. He wouldn't paint it. He wouldn't even bail it out. And I headed up to here one day, and I said, if you don't start taking care of this, I'm going to take care of it. And he didn't do any more, so I went down with my saw at age 7 and cut the boat in half and cut a piece of plywood and screwed it on my side, and away I went. So, and 40 years later, I bought a Criff-Craft sedan that was built down in the Falconer, 30-foot sedan that was built down in the Falconer plant, and restored it with a partner, and that didn't work either. So, looking for another one to restore, but it'll be a solo flight.
So, by the way, you went to Kent State. We're going to digress here for just a second. You went to Kent State, and at the time of the shootings.
Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about that? Just because that's history. You were there on something which was sort of a moment in time in our nation's history.
Well, it was a difficult time in our history. Fortunately or unfortunately, I had come home for the weekend, so I wasn't directly involved in the goings-on over the weekend at Kent. I had a lot of friends that were, and I think there's a stigma associated with that is still present, both for the college and the individuals that were there.
Now, Vince Horrigan was there as well at Kent State. Did your paths cross with his?
Vince was, and Doug Conroe was.
Oh, really?
Doug found me, he was head of the judicial board for the residence halls, and being that I was 18 and a man of the world, I brought home a bottle of 100 Piper Scotch from here to Kent, and Doug got wind of it, and I had to go in front of the judicial board and spend every weekend for a semester signing in twice an evening at the desk. So Doug and I have a long history. And Vince and I do too. Vince is from Ohio, but I call him our unofficial, official Bemis Point resident. Vince was a tremendous county exec, and he and his family, especially his dad and mom, great friends over the years. So proud to call him a friend.
So let me get this straight. You ran afoul of Kent State.
Yes.
And then you were brought before Judge Conroe.
Judge Conroe.
And you had to pay penance.
That's correct.
And did you ever get to drink this?
No.
Never got to.
I don't even like scotch.
Oh man, can we? Yeah, okay, it's too bad Doug's not here. So what else was Doug's reputation down there? Was he? I could visualize him, one of those guys in Animal House, who's the straight lace.
He was, and we were Animal House. He was a good guy, though.
Now you say that.
Yeah.
Okay. Back to the book, The History of Chris Craft Corporation's Jamestown Division in Falconer, New York, 1943 to 1948. And again, as I mentioned, I've spent 40 years hanging around down there, and I've never heard this story until you mentioned it 2 years ago. How did you learn about this? What's the...
Well, a lady by the name of Jane Gordon Gifford, Lawrence, is a member, as is her husband, Giff, and her father and brothers worked at that facility, and one day she came in. I'm a docent down at the Lawson Center, and she came in with a picture. And it was an aerial view of the facility in probably 1947 with some writing on, it was done after the fact, showing which production lines were where in the facility. And I began taking interest, not having known that there was a Chris Craft facility here in Jamestown. Did some research, and the research led me down to the Mariners Museum in Norfolk, but unfortunately, even though all of Chris Craft's records for that facility had been transferred to the Mariners Museum, that particular portion of the museum is closed for about a 2-year period while they reorganize it, so I didn't have access to any of that information. So.
We got Faulkner. They have, before we get into the site, you had to obviously, as part of this book, set forth the history of Chris Craft. Was there a guy named Chris Craft? How did that work?
Actually, the gentleman's name was Christopher Columbus Smith. And he was born in 1861. His family lived up in Algonac. And that's where he and his brother actually started the first boat building company that eventually became Chris Craft Corporation.
What year was that?
I believe 1874 they built their first boat together, and 1881 officially became what we now know as Chris Craft. But it's had about a dozen iterations, various ownerships. It's currently owned by Stellicon, which is an LLC out of, I believe, Toronto. And they still have a presence down in Florida building boats. And they're a very fine boat, but they're not the mahogany version that we all came to know and love here on Chautauqua Lake.
So, as it found its way to manufacturing and then ultimately dealerships, because at some point it ends up on places like Chautauqua Lake, when did it first decide that it was sort of a regional and national name? When did you get a sense that that was special?
Probably in about 1910. About that time, Christopher Smith paired up with a guy by the name of Jack Baldy Ryan. And Ryan was a rich degenerate. He was a gambler and a horse racer and owned a string of theaters, and I hope nobody's related to him here. But he saw that Chris Smith was building some really great race boats and decided to partner up with him and had the money to interest Smith in doing so. And the two began building racing hydroplanes. Chris Smith had patented what they called a single-step hydroplane. It had been previously patented by a Frenchman in a multi-step design. But what those steps allowed the boat to do was actually ride up above the water. It ceased to become a displacement. It actually got it up more on top of the water, so you used less energy to propel it. And what they would do is race a boat to failure and then go back to the drawing table and redesign it, put a different design or a different width or length or weight or motor or whatever in it, and then race it to failure again. And this was being done by a number of boat companies in that Detroit metro area. And one of the boats that they designed was called the Reliance 4. And the Reliance came here to Little Chautauqua Lake and was raced against a boat by the name of the BITW. And I've never found out what that meant, but I conjectured that it might be best in the world. And they raced out here, and interestingly, Klein Crawford, who was a local resident, raced the Reliance against the BITW, which was owned by Mr. Sheldon. And he had it built at what was then John O. Johnson's boat livery in Bemis Point, which eventually became the Lawson Center. So that was the first of several tie-ins, if you will, of Chris Craft to Chautauqua Lake. And people say, well, why Chautauqua Lake? But when you consider the geography of where we're located, about 150 miles to Pittsburgh, likewise to Cleveland, Toronto, maybe 400 to New York, it was a good central location. And we had, obviously, Chautauqua Institution here, where we had the arts and sciences and people of means that would enjoy that kind of outing. So they raced a series here and then went up to Buffalo, and eventually the Reliance went to her watery grave on the Niagara River. So.
Was Chautauqua Lake a location for hydro racing? Was I often don't, and if so, have you ever studied much about that? Was this a location of note?
It wasn't really a center for it, but there were people like John Packard, who had the Calera, which was a very notable Michigan boatworks boat that raced out here. And we do have pictures of that at the Lawson Center. There's several others that did race out here on the lake.
What was a race like? Was it just either a straight run, or was it a actual?
They would race a circle, and there'd be times when one of the participants would win, and the other one would just keep on having fun, making laps. And it was great sport.
Was this Klein Crawford of Pittsburgh? Was that the guy who created Crawford Furniture?
I believe it was.
Which in turn, Klein sold it to Carl Kappa, who in turn has created the Jackson Center. Not that that is any difference if I just...
Just happens to be.
You knew that, Don, didn't you?
I knew you didn't know it.
Yeah, Ralph Sheldon died, and ultimately that family became the Sheldon Foundation, which the rest is history. This is important stuff. Then what happens to that? I mean, it's got now some sort of a national name, Chris Craft. What were its competitors at that time? What were the other big names?
Well, one of the competitors ended up, Jack Ryan bailed on Chris Smith and took $100,000 out of the safe, and I think in looking back, he was probably interested in partnering with Chris Smith to eventually take that whole boat works out to the East Coast, to Connecticut, where they would make military contract boats and do far better. But they eventually, because of that, he and Chris Smith parted company, and Chris went on to build one more major race boat, and that was the Miss Detroit, and that was built for a syndicate of race fans from Detroit, all pitched in, and it did very well initially, but then little by little it kept getting beat up. You know, these races took their toll, and Chris hadn't been paid entirely for the boat. He was on the hook for about a little under $2,000. So he decided he would kind of put the boat up and see if anybody would buy it. And a gentleman by the name of Arthur Garwood, purchased the boat, and then ended up purchasing a majority interest in Chris Craft, which he held for a while. But his would have been one of the boats. Higgins would have been another. There was a whole host of boats at that time being produced in the Detroit, Michigan area.
What did the World War I, you know, the end of the war, there's all this supplies that were available probably after the war. Did things like engines, were they available? Did that make a difference?
Absolutely did. When we think of a boat, we tend to think of either a single engine or maybe a dual engine boat, and the engines are usually set down into the boat. The boats that they would run in a lot of these races were as many as 4 engines. And these weren't little engines. They were, for the most part, early on, military surplus. They were Curtiss Jenny bi-wing airplane engines, and pretty powerful. Later on, they would go to Packard engines and boats that were certainly better powered. But Chris Smith actually bought up the majority of the Curtiss engines that were built out here in the mid-state region out near Hammondsport.
So the Curtiss engine, which is well known in the Buffalo area, they have.
Oh, yeah.
So that would be more part of that. The Garwood, he was a big deal. I mean, he's a kind of a legendary
He was.
driver.
He was. Loved to race. But what really struck me about him, he was a strikingly handsome man. Very tall in stature and angular, and he just, if you could design somebody to go out there and be a famous boat manufacturing owner and boat racer, it would be Garwood. Chris Smith was a little short guy with stubby cigars that he smoked. And, you know.
And then at some point, Garwood had bought the majority interest from Chris Smith, but then Chris got it back, right?
Chris and his sons bought it back. It was probably one of the best things they could have done. His sons were old enough to take the reins in the company, and they got enough money together. By the way, even though they were really centered in the racing industry, as far as mentally, they continued to build recreational boats all during that time. They never lost that bigger vision.
There was during that time period, again, this is the Roaring 20s, 1926 specifically, you mentioned in your book about the participation in the New York City National Motor Boat Show. And tell us a little bit about what that would look like. I mean, now we know boat shows up in Buffalo and other places, but what would have been like in the 20s?
Well, even in the 20s, in January, they'd have the New York City Boat Show, and it was the place to go if you wanted to find a boat to your liking that you wanted to buy. And one of the first dealers was John Wanamaker, but believe it or not, our own David Lawson, who owned LSL Marine, is now the Lawson Boat Center over in Bemis, jumped into that dealership very, very early on. I have a Saturday Evening Post with an ad in it that lists D.S. Lawson of Bemis Point from 1928. So he was a very early dealer. His dad bought the business from John O. Johnston in 1918, making this their 100th year in business.
So Chris Craft is really known as a producer of mahogany watercraft. I mean, that's really what you think when you think Chris Craft. Was there a point when they decided mahogany was the way to go, because that's become iconic?
I think the mahogany really started because when you think of homes and of that era, those that were moneyed afforded beautiful mahogany furnishings. And so it was a natural outgrowth. If you're going to have a boat, you want it to really look like something great. So mahogany was very good wood as far as being seaworthy. It didn't, it would swell up and take to the water very easy. But also it had people wanted that richness.
There's also the idea of a level riding boat. I mean, sometimes boats, are kind of going like this, or, but you kind of see a Chris Craft that just sort of skims along.
Chris Craft really came up with the idea of level ride because if you could get the boat up on plane, it didn't have to keep knifing through waves. The early ones, the weight was centered towards the aft, and so each wave you'd have to kind of pound your way through it. This way you could knife your way through it and gave you a much, much nicer ride.
Was there, during that time period, again, the Roaring 20s, 30s, when it was really starting to spike, was there individuals or celebrity endorsers or guys that you would see in the ads that were sort of associated with Chris Craft? Was there anybody like that?
I don't know I can point to any individual, but Chris Craft was kind of a great marketer throughout their entire essence. They were some of the first to, for instance, market in non-boating magazines. They would market in things like National Geographic. They would partner with some of the manufacturers of the components of their boat, with the brass makers or with the wood producers or things like that, which broadened their appeal. They would, in the late 20s, when we were starting to see decline in available money, they came out with a utility craft, which made it more available to the masses. I mean, they were always great marketers. Up here I have a whole series, or part of a series, of ads that they came out in World War II with. And these boats were never built. They're artist concept drawings of boats that they would put in advertisements, and down here it says, buy U.S. bonds today, tomorrow command your own Chris Craft. It was just kind of salting that mentality away in the families and the veterans and the active soldiers and sailors that I'm going to come home and buy me a Chris Craft. So they had all different kinds of these different sizes and that they would advertise like this, just to keep the interest out there, even though in World War II they ceased production of recreational boats and went strictly to military contract boats.
I've been reading here that we know about the Higgins landing craft, just as a name, the Higgins. Chris Craft had its competitive landing craft too, didn't it?
Yes. In 1939, Chris Craft went head-on-head with Higgins in sea trials. The Higgins boat had, I believe, one engine, the Chris Craft two, and Chris Craft didn't get the majority share of landing crafts, but they got enough contract boats to build over 8,000 landing craft and a total of 12,000 military boats during the war. So they had quite a presence during World War II.
Where were they making these boats then?
Well, at that time, their production was still centered in Algonac, Michigan. They began in 30...
By the way, where is that?
It's just up by Detroit.
Okay.
They began in 19... where were they going? 1939, I believe, expanding. And they built plants in Cadillac and Holland, Michigan, and in Grand Rapids. And it was Grand Rapids probably that was very similar in nature to Jamestown, New York, because it was a furniture making city. They had a lot of skilled craftsmen. They had also had problems during the Depression, which had idled, a substantial number of good craftsmen. So it was very akin to Jamestown, New York, which would be their next target, their first plant outside of Michigan.
These boats, just so we know, these were inboard.
Yes.
Right? Not inboard. At some point, they had the outboard part too, didn't they? Chris
Craft, people have the vision primarily, I think, of on Golden Pond when a guy takes his grandson out there, the Thayers go out in the boat, and the kid is just taken by this boat. Chris Craft went on to make sailboats, to make kit boats in 1951 because they knew people didn't have the money to shell out for an expensive boat. You could build your own. They did deferred payments. They did a whole bunch of new things, but they built camping trailers, aluminum camping trailers. They even built an RV. There's only one known in existence. It was a frame with a skin over it. Looked very similar to today's RVs. They built gun cabinets. They built all kinds of things.
How did it get here? How did it get to Chautauqua County? Give me the genesis of a plant in Chautauqua County.
Well, I mentioned that Dave Lawson started his distributorship in 1928. And at that time, the principal production was in Algonac. You could get a boat shipped here, which would have come into probably Mayville, and you'd had to gone up and pick it up, possibly into Bemis. But what would happen, to save a few bucks, Dave would take the money out of the petty cash and take their flatbed trailer and head on out to Algonac and buy a boat and have it loaded. And presumably when he was there, Dave tells me his father would talk about Jamestown, talk about the tremendous craftsmen we had here, talk about the availability of white oak, which was one of the other components in the boats, talk about the availability of land and just the nature of the people, and I'm sure tell him he thought this would be a great place to build boats.
Well, why Falconer? Why that area? Railroad. I mean, it had a significant rail.
It had a rail siding. The property that they eventually bought in Falconer had a rail siding, which gave them ready access to raw material, and also gave them a principal means of getting their boats to market. But beyond that, I think it was, the area was growing still, good workforce, good transportation, and again, that geographic locality midway between a number of major cities. So it was a good marketing ploy.
I see a statement attributed to the Chris Craft plant superintendent about why Jamestown. He said, a lot of Jamestown area people think the officials at the home offices in Algonac, Michigan, picked the site for their first factory outside the state of Michigan because of Chautauqua Lake. That wasn't the reason at all. It was because of the labor market, which proved skilled wood craftsmen.
Yep.
And so they can you walk us through the construction and kind of where it's located, where it was located?
Okay. If you're familiar with Jamestown, if you go out Allen Street Extension, it comes to a stop sign on 380, I believe it is, in Falconer, Work Street. Greg, you're the counsel. You give me some direction.
Just go down Main Street into Falconer and
turn right.
Turn right, and you're going to get
up over the bridge.
Up over the bridge, and you turn immediately to the left, and it's back in there.
It's New York Avenue, and it's the current site of Carborundum Corporation.
When did you start interviewing me? How did this work? When did I lose control of this operation?
Yeah.
So 50 men wanted, skilled and semi-skilled woodworkers, some tools necessary, apply at office, bus service to the plant, Chris Craft Corp., Falconer, New York. When they got started in 1945, what was the sense? Was there kind of immediate success? Was there a rise? What was the...
Well, there's a lot of optimism, tremendous optimism. They thought eventually that they would be hiring well over 500 people. When they built the building, it was considered a modern building of the times. It was a glass block building, or glass windows from about 4 feet up and block below that. But it was built with knockout portions that were simply wooden studs, because they already had plans to expand that building to build boats up to 42 foot in length. Their initial Their initial boats were 4. They built a 16-foot runabout, a 26-foot dinette, and a 26-foot deluxe. And then they went on later in, I think, 47 to build a 30-foot sedan, Chris Craft sedan. So they built 4 different versions down there. And in terms of boats, number of boats, it wasn't a huge number. We at the Lawson Center were fortunate to have 2 of the 16-foot runabouts. One was owned by Mr. Bill Locke, who lived over here in DeWittville, and the other one by a gentleman by the name of Jack Van Scoter. Jack's was built first. It was R16, and this would be a hull number, which would be on the hull and on the engine, R16 220. And believe it or not, Bill's was 221. So they were sequential coming off that production line. The first of the 16-footers came off as a group of 18 boats that was kind of a trial run, if you will. The first 16-footer came out and was christened in Chautauqua Lake. It was the only boat to have been christened in Chautauqua from that facility, and then went out to Illinois to have a home. And I've diligently looked to try and find it, but there are people out there in licensing and registrations and that don't see a real significance for them in knowing who this was, so they haven't really gotten back to me, but it would be interesting to know if that boat still exists.
And in addition to the 16-foot boats, they also did 30-foot boats, the sedans. The
30-foot sedan, I had one of the Falconer 30-foot sedans. It was a twin-engine boat. It had about an 8-foot beam, and very, very comfortable. For those of you that are boaters, a twin-engine, you know, is just a great thing to pilot because you can turn them around on a dime. You can park them in next to no space at all. Just a great boat. And we were fortunate enough to have the inside edge at Jamestown Electroplating because my partner's wife worked there, and so she got all the bright work re-chromed for us, and we stripped the boat down to bare wood and painted and varnished and had it looking probably better than it had in years.
What year would that have been, yours?
I owned it in 86 and 87.
Okay.
So it's been too long since I've had one. I need another.
Just, my dad was one of the owners of Jamestown Electroplating. I wondered if he knew all that was happening. Do you know Lyle Peterson at all? Yeah. Okay. This is a great book. I'm not telling you to buy it for $20 at charitable deduction, but I would. This is great stuff. And Chris Smith had been the first boat manufacturer to adopt the modern day practice of mass producing boats on the assembly line. Think Ford. The process helped ensure uniformity, increased efficiency, and reduced production costs. That kind of efficiency would be of paramount importance at the facility because of Chris Craft's backlog of orders. In fact, the Jamestown Post-Journal reported, "Don't get the idea that because Chris Craft has come to Jamestown that it will be easy to get a boat. In fact, it is as difficult to buy a Chris Craft as it is to get a new order. Orders are so backlogged that persons putting in their orders now might get delivery in a year or a year and a half."
Yep.
That much demand?
There's a huge demand initially. Compared to what they thought, it wasn't quite as much. What happened after the war, guys came home from the service. They had put away money, many of them, during the war, but they came home to families that they had to house. They wanted new homes. They wanted cars. They wanted to educate their children. So it wasn't a slam dunk for Chris Craft. They had some competition in the economics of it all. And what had happened during the war, the dollar had devalued to an extent, so it took a little bit more to buy a Chris Craft or anything else. And the availability of mahogany all but disappeared because the damage that had been done in the islands where these things, the lumber was cut. So, and actually, truth be known, Philippine mahogany, which was the touted wood for Chris Craft, was not what Chris Craft was made of. There isn't, in fact, a wood called Philippine mahogany. It was a marketing tool that was used. The Chris Crafts were mostly what we call red Meranti, M-E-R-A-N-T-I, as a species. And even that became hard to find, so they began using Spanish cedar. And it didn't stain the same as mahogany. So after the war, many of the Chris Crafts were painted white. And you see them either be white or go to a, probably in the late 40s, early 50s, go to a plywood construction. I got to go back to your straight line production. Chris Smith was a brilliant man. He took his cue from the auto manufacturers. Those boats, you could take a plank, which is the term for the piece of wood, and there's multiple planks on the side of a boat. You could take a plank from one Chris Craft and it would fit another of the same model. It was machined ahead of time to a pattern, and the labor force was all set up and trained in their specific job. So it was very, very akin to the auto industry, right? Straight down the line. Greg would put the keel in, somebody would put the frame members in and start putting the side planks on. I mean, everybody had a dedicated job.
Ooh. So from a corporate perspective, this was the first non-Michigan location within the Chris Craft Corporation. Did they subsequently have other ones that they created throughout the country?
They did. Over time, there was about 12 divisions, and I think the most distant was in Italy. But Chris Craft is a very different company now. It's most of their boats, all of their boats, I believe now, are fiberglass. They may have some lumber in them, but they're fiberglass. Maintenance is a lot easier on a glass boat than on others.
So its lifespan in Falconer, 1943, 44 through 1948, what was the kind of demise? Did you were able to find that moment or that press release where it said the demand is not there and we have to shut it down? What was the reason for this?
Well, there was a number of reasons for the end at Falconer. The lack of wood being one, but I think primarily the Smith family had been through two periods of union unrest in other facilities. 1931, 1931, 37, and 41, I think, were the three principal times of unrest. And the Smith family had run a family boat business, and their employees were friends in most cases. And to have someone you considered a friend, they were unionized, and all of a sudden your friends weren't your friends anymore. They had people leading them in strikes, and some of these strikes were extremely contentious. So it was not the Chris Smith family boat industry that they wanted to see. And that began to happen in Jamestown. The workforce was unionized. They wanted to have separate unions for each particular trade, an electrical union, a mechanical union, a woodworkers union, etc. They wanted more benefits. They were already about double the hourly wage, average hourly wage in the United States. So they were, by all accounts, doing fairly well. But I think Chris Smith's heart wasn't in it to go through another strike. He had died by that time. It was more his son Jay that was leading the charge at that time. But interestingly, my wife, who takes very little interest in history, her ears perked up when I started talking about the union relationships, because it was her uncle, Ben Spitali, and I'll bet Greg may even remember.
I remember him well.
Was the union steward who negotiated the contracts.
Yeah, Ben became a city councilman. And,
Yep.
All that. So do you get a sense that once the union vote was taken, I'm reading a little bit here now, September of 1947, Buffalo Evening News reported that a vote was scheduled for Sunday, September 13th, 2 days before the end of the contract. The article indicated that there had been previously meetings, but the talks had failed to bring about an agreement. The results of the vote by the membership resulted in a strike, and was that it then? Did they decide they weren't going to reopen?
They tried to negotiate. Negotiations fell apart. Interestingly enough, the strike at the Chris Craft plant, I believe, was the first under the Taft-Hartley law, which is pretty interesting right here in Jamestown, New York. And the other thing that happened, I think, in 1948, the gentleman who had been Chris Craft's chief engineer and had designed this facility and several others of the Chris Craft Corporation moved here, lived down near Warren, and his name was Don McCarrer. And Don's 18-year-old son was killed in an auto accident. And I think many of us as parents would know that would just take your heart and soul to lose a son. So I don't think his heart was in this place anymore.
So as you mentioned, of the firm's, Chris Craft's 7 facilities, only the Jamestown division was involved in the strike. And unfortunately, within a month's time, the news was dismal. The Falconer Chris Craft plant would close. What happened to the building and the contents thereafter?
Well, it didn't take long. They closed. They said that they would close the plant, I believe it was July 1st, and by July 3rd, they were selling the contents. Interestingly enough, if you go down to the Lawson Center and walk into what we call the showroom area, which is the street level on the right-hand side, if you look up, there are 3 very large I-beams. And Dave Lawson went down to the auction and bought those 3 I-beams and the floor and ceiling wood from what had been planned for an addition to the Chris Craft building.
So the building then got purchased by a company which was headquartered in Buffalo, Carborundum.
Carborundum Corporation. There was a little bit of a sticking point early on in that Carborundum required huge amounts of electricity, and I don't think early in the negotiations they were assured that they could get enough. They do fusible, what would you call it, Greg? Fusible crystalline products, if you will. Mm-hmm. And it takes a lot of energy to do that. And I think eventually they came around, had the assurance that they could get enough energy down there, and went ahead and I believe the purchase price was somewhere around $300,000 for the facility.
So as you were writing the book and you captured for many something that very few people knew about. They certainly knew about Chris Craft. They had this iconic boat that you see on the water and say, wow, that's spectacular. But you wrote something here that not many people knew about, and as you sit here today in front of our august crowd of people from Chautauqua, what's the legacy of that? What's that legacy of that little nugget in time here of the Chris Craft at Falconer?
I think more than the geography of the location would be the boats themselves. Anybody who has boated, really it's the epitome of boating to many people. If you have a Chris Craft and you hear that deep throaty engine, there's just nothing like it. And it's something I hope you all get a chance to participate in or enjoy.
As you reflect back on the number of, do you actually know kind of the number of boats that actually went through that plant? You know, you had 16-footers, the 30-footers. There were four, I think, four types.
Four total.
Do you have any sense of what actually produced there?
Wasn't a huge number, Greg. I would say less than 5,000.
Okay. And the normal course, they would be shipped out of there, and they weren't necessarily sold locally. It was a production plant.
They went all over the world.
Yeah.
Yeah. As I say, the first 16-footer went to Illinois. I think the first 26-footer, there's a notation on the photograph down there. There was enough community pride in it that they put it up on 3rd Street in Cherry and left it up there for several days. And it was in the newspaper. Photographs of it up there.
Okay, now you've done this book, and last year, like 2 years ago, when you were talking about the lake and you being a self-proclaimed lake rat, what's the next book? Give us the teaser.
Well, I had
Remember, you told your wife this was it.
Yeah.
I get that. Yeah.
I had a choice of two. Chautauqua Lake has had a lot of boat builders. From the gentleman who built the steamboats right down to people who built little double-end rowboats. And I found probably 50 or 60 individuals who were boat builders on the lake. But I've kind of settled on a book on timbering the watershed of Chautauqua. That goes back a long ways, and it's sometimes a little difficult with older topics. I'm back in the 1820s now, 1810, doing the research, and I'm thinking just not going to find enough information, and particularly not enough photographs, because people love photographs. But I've got right now 2 4-inch binders of articles from the Jamestown papers on sawmills and rafting on Chautauqua Lake. And people say, well, you know, it couldn't have been that much because there aren't any big rivers or anything here. But what would happen, the people that lumbered and sawed that lumber would build rafts, even on small streams. They'd build a course of boards 16 feet long this way, and then they'd put a course 90 degrees to it and build up a raft about 25 to 30 courses of 1.25 boards thick. Then they'd drill holes in the corners and put what they called trunnels or tree nails in those corners, and those were made by small saplings pulled from the ground and then the root ball was pruned off to leave a knob. And they'd put that knob down so it couldn't get loose, and they would build a dam on the creek by their sawmill, let the water build up, and then cut it loose, and the raft would go on down the river. The rafts would be coupled together down around Levant.
By the way, that sound you hear is what Doug Conroe sets off when there's a sighting of Ned Ward. I just wanted to let you know, so if you see some activity soon, you'll know what that is.
Time to run. But they would build these rafts and couple them together and go all the way down to the Ohio River, where at Pittsburgh they might have a raft coupled with another raft, so that it might be 500 or 600 feet long and 200 or 300 feet wide. And there'd be guys on both ends of the raft with 30-foot oars. Now these were men, and they wouldn't propel the raft with that. That was the job of the water. They would just steer it. And they would take those rafts as far south as New Orleans. If they could sell them at an advantage in Pittsburgh, they would. Or they might go to Cincinnati. These folks are originally Cincinnati folks. Or any of the cities along that riverway. And then they'd walk home.
Oh my goodness.
And one of the first legislations passed by our county legislature, our, give me the right term, county legislature, was to set the date of voting back sufficient for the raftsmen to walk back. If you look around Jamestown, Foote Avenue, Pernagast Avenue, Marvin Parkway, all these are lumbermen. They came here to build a forest industry, and they built a great one. Jamestown was a huge, huge hub of lumbering, and later on of goods made from that lumber. And I'm just really enjoying the research for this book more than any other I've ever done. So I hope when it comes out that I can do the same thing I did with this. I'd like to be able to donate the book to possibly the County Historical Society or the Fenton Historical Society as a fundraiser. But it just tells a great tale of a great community. And I hope if it comes out, you enjoy it and buy it and benefit one of those institutions.
And we'll have you back here.
I'll be back.
You're quite the storyteller. I'm telling you, this is fantastic. Before we let you go, we're running a little short, but you've done all of this around Chautauqua Lake.
Yes.
I'm going to ask you a question which you can defer and say, I won't, Greg, another day. But this is Chautauqua Lake itself today. Do you have a sense of its health, and do you have any reflections on that? And you can defer that. You can say, Greg, this has been fun.
No. I did an op-ed not too long ago in the Post-Journal. I am a conservationist by nature. I believe that it's important to have short-term goals and long-term goals. Our short-term goals have to be to make the lake a pleasant place to boat and fish, recreate, and have property ownership on. But we can't keep spending the money that we are for that maintenance and fail to address the root cause of these problems. We need the sewer district completed. It's going to cost money. It will never be cheaper than it is today. It will appreciate the value of homes in and around the lake. It's a county problem. not a Chautauqua Lake problem because, if I remember the numbers, about 26% of our county's revenue can be directly or indirectly tied to the lake. We need to address how we plow roads, why we ditch roads, how we maintain barriers along creeks to keep erosion from happening. We certainly need to address lawn fertilizers. If you're going to fertilize, you really ought to know what fertilizer you need. We can't just apply routinely the same fertilizer. I had a guy come and give me a price to fertilize my lawn. He never even took a sample. We need to address root causes.
What's the question you expected I would ask you today that I haven't?
Why my grandfather gave up Ward's ice cream parlor in Bemis Point.
Well, that's what Don was going to ask that, but go ahead. Why don't you answer that?
I don't know. I'm a fifth generation Chautauqua person. My great-grandfather came here, was a pilot on the steamboats. He invented the double box spring mattress and many of the improvements that went on with that later at the spring company here in Mayville. Owned the ice cream parlor at what is now the Italian Fisherman. When his daughter married my grandfather, my grandfather and his wife took it over, and I have a favorite ice cream scoop at home, one of the old shuttle kind, and it has a wooden handle that the wood has probably about that much of a wear mark where his thumb would go back and forth on it as he scooped ice cream. And he was at one time Seal Test Ice Cream's largest dealer in Little Bemis Point, New York. So,
And that site became subsequently owned by, was it Norm Berg? Did he own that?
Norm had part of it for a while, and now it's the Italian Fisherman. Yeah.
You're terrific. I really appreciate this. And we probably don't have time for questions, but Ned will be here. I highly recommend you take a look at these photos, and he's got a few books he brought with you, and
Yep.
let's pretend they're $20 tonight. And thank you. I thank
You're
you
welcome.
very much.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you for coming out.